that was first prayed over 50 years ago at the Second Vatican Council of the events in Rome this past week. And I think we see that fresh winds are blowing into our church from this new leader, and a different style, a different pastoral style. And if we listen to his homily yesterday, we see that he spoke so strongly about our need to be protectors of one another, to be caring for one another, to be tender towards one another. And I think he really gets this idea that the key to the renewal of our churches is this sense of belonging, caring for one another. You see in the slide in front of you, the title, Belonging is the Key to the New Evangelization, is a subtitle. The primary title is an exclamation. It was attributed to pagans in the early church in the writings of Tertullian, that as they gazed upon the way in which the Christian church lived, this is what they said: see how we love one another. They were provoked to ask questions about the Christian faith by what they saw being lived out within the Christian community. And I believe that was in many ways the key to opening the doors for the proclamation of the gospel in the early church. And so it will be today in our own culture and our own time, when our culture in many ways has a very much a kind of been there, done that attitude towards the Christian faith, towards the church. I got the T-shirt. It didn't really do it for me, and I've moved on. And the greatest way that we can address this post-Christian culture is by radical living of the gospel, expressed through a vibrant community. So that's the theme. I want to begin, ask Lisa to bump the next slide over here. We're working in tandem here. Thank you, Lisa. I want to begin with a question. What are we willing to do for the sake of renewal in our churches? Because this is a key question that every single leader has to examine within her or his heart. What are we willing to do? Because we know that renewal in our churches requires change. Change is never easy. It's never easy. Someone once said that I have no problem with change as long as I don't have to do anything differently. And of course, change means that we have to do things differently. So what are we willing to do? And I'd like to show you a little quick 30-second TV commercial. I like short videos, funny videos, so check this out. No, I hope you're all laughing. It's a silly video, but it makes a very interesting observation about human nature. And that is, in the end, most of us, most of the time, will do whatever it takes to get what we want. So if we're not doing whatever it takes, the question is, how badly do we want it? How much do we really desire renewal in our churches? A little bit about myself. Lisa told you that I'm from St. Benedict Parish, and Lisa, if you can just move over to the next slide again. Here's a picture of the interior of my parish. It's a newly built church, opened on May 16th, 2010, and I came in as pastor 2 months later. And I came in at a time when everyone was relieved, because not only was this a process of building a new physical church, but it also involved the amalgamation of 3 previously existing parishes, smaller parishes that all were about half a mile from one another. They were amalgamated under the previous pastor. They became one legally and canonically, even though they continued to exist in 3 different buildings. And then very slowly they sold off the buildings, and as they were building the new church, all 3 communities eventually came into this one building in May. So when I arrived 2 months later, there was a great sense of relief. People were saying, oh, thanks be to God, we've gone through all this change. It's been so difficult, but finally we're here, and now we can kind of sit back and relax. And I arrived, and my message from the beginning was, well, guess what, folks? The changes that we've gone through at this point, as difficult as they have been cosmetic. We've changed the address and we've changed the furniture. And I used the parable of Jesus, who spoke about putting new wine into new wineskins. We'll just get our next slide there, Lisa. Now I know I'm putting a bit of a twist on the actual meaning of the parable, because Jesus, of course, is the new wine who explodes and bursts any attempts to contain him, any attempts to define him by the old ways. But in some ways, I said to the people that we have been given a new wineskin, and we'll go to the next slide. And the new wineskin is this beautiful church building. This is a photograph of when the walls were going up. We've been given the gift of this beautiful place. And into this new wineskin, we must become the new wine, because if we come into this church and simply do everything exactly the same way as we've been doing it, if we, our church, live out church the exact same way as we did before, then nothing is going to stop all of the forces and culture and all of the dynamics that necessitated the amalgamation and closure of these 3 previously existing parishes. The decline will continue. The decline, if it's to be arrested, if it's to be turned around to become health and growth, means that we have to change how we do things, how we are church. We have to, in a sense, change the culture of our parishes. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, by culture, I mean simply the things that we take for granted, the presumptions that we make about church life, about what's normative in our lives as Catholics. And so what we need is a total reframing of what is normative. It's not enough to build a church of bricks and mortar. We must put as much, if not more, effort into rebuilding the church of living stones. And again, another little 30-second video, just to give you a little glimpse of this new church building. It's a little compilation that we made, just to give you a sense of what our church looks like. So that's the church. Oops, there it goes again. So that's our church building. As you can see, it's an absolutely gorgeous place. I have to pinch myself to think that I'm blessed to be the pastor of this place. And not only are we gifted with this beautiful building, state-of-the-art, but we've got amazing people. You get the leadership core, the cream of the crop of 3 different parishes who have come together, who are willing and eager to serve. And the greatest thing that happened in coming to St. Benedict is that I had an empty canvas to work with. You know, in arriving in August of the first year in the building, there was no established customs in this new place. No one culture from the 3 previously existing parishes could claim the building as their own. No one could say those famous words that have stymied and crippled the pastoral initiatives over the years. And those words are, of course, that's not the way we do it here at St. Benedict. No one could say that. So we were blessed in that way. Lisa, if we can go back to the main slides. So we must foster a change in the culture of our parishes. Now, this is a huge task. Think about this. I mean, in recent years, we've undergone the most accelerated change, social change in human history. For the first time in terms of church culture, we find ourselves since the beginning of the 4th century not with the dominant culture. I mean, let's be honest, since the Edict of Milan, when Christianity became legalized, it very soon became the preferred religion. The emperor had leanings towards Christianity. His members of his family, where he eventually would become Christian, and if you were upwardly mobile, that's where you went. And really, we've sat in that dominant position ever since, until the last 20 years or so. So there's a huge need for us to adjust the culture of church to match the changes that have happened in our society, so that we can be healthy. Because for so many centuries, we have relied so much on the popular culture to kind of prop us up. So this is a huge thing in Catholic culture to try to overcome 1,400 years of doing things in a particular way is not going to happen overnight. So we're aiming for big things here, and the kind of culture change we're talking about, just to give a few quick examples, are things like, moving from adult faith formation to being normative, moving from a maintenance mode to a missionary mode, to be truly outward focuses within our parishes. These are challenging things for us. And we'll go to the next slide. I've got a quote from Michelangelo that I find very inspiring. He reminds us that the greater danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it's too low and we reach it. So this brings us to the topic of the day, the focus on belonging. And of course, the talk is entitled Belonging as the Key to the New Evangelization, or the key to parish renewal, the key to getting where we need to go. And if you think about a key, what a key is a means to something. A key opens a door, but the goal of the key is not simply, that's not the end goal. The goal is to open the door so that you can walk through the door, so that we can move from one place to another. So what we're proposing is the concept of belonging is not just simply a means to an end, it is the means to a means to an end. It opens a door which then must be walked through. So that tells us right away that the point of the key is not the key. The point of aiming to bring about a culture of belonging in our parishes is not just so we can all feel good about ourselves. It's a means to an end. And I'm going to get to more of that. That's the substance of the talk coming up. What is the ultimate end? What is the end game that's taking place within our parishes, or should be taking place within our parishes? Well, of course, we need to turn to the grand mission statement given to us by Jesus himself, and that is where the mission of the church is defined in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 to 20. And we'll just go to the next slide, please. You know this passage. It's right before the ascension. We hear those great words that the disciples surrounded Jesus. Some of them worshiped, some of them hesitated. It's always been such in the church. But Jesus gives these words: "Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all the commands I gave you, and look, I am with you always until the end of time." We will see, and I'll just ask Lisa to just move along with the slides here, that there are 4 tasks given to us in the Great Commission. There's the imperative to go, to make, to baptize, and to teach. Now, these are our marching orders. Now, it's very interesting when we look at this passage in the original language, in the Greek. This doesn't always come out in translation. But one of these verbs is actually, there's only one of these verbs is a finite verb, and the other verbs are participles. They're verbal nouns. So grammatically, they are anchored to that finite verb. The sentence is held together by the finite verb. If there's any people who love grammar who are listening in, you'll know what I'm saying. So the participles are conditional in a sense. They revolve around the finite verb grammatically in the meaning of the sentence. And I believe that we could argue that theologically this is the case as well. The Great Commission is not just 4 tasks that Jesus has given us. It's one central task around which the other 3 revolve and are conditional upon. Now, I'd like to invite you to make a little guess as to which of these 4 may be the central one. So there's 35 of us on this line. So I would say the chances are about 8 of us are probably going to get this right. Someone's wagering. We've got a goal there appearing on the screen. Anyone else want to take a stab? So there's 4 tasks, and we'll just go to the next slide and see what's on the next slide. You'll see right away the answer is to make disciples. The 4 verbs, 3 participles, 1 finite verb. And the task to make disciples in the Greek is actually one word. It's matatusete, which literally means make disciples. And you know something, when I mention this at talks, I'll often get people at the end to put up their hands. Now, I can't see you. I don't know who's putting up their hands. I'm not sure who got this right. Did anyone choose make? Anyone choose the verb make? You can simply type in I did if you did. But typically, it's chosen by very, very, very few people. I did a talk 2 weeks ago in Toronto to 3,500 people, and about 8 people put up their hands. 8 people out of 3,500 chose make. And it's consistently the case that a remarkably low, proportionally low number of people actually choose make. And I think that tells us something of our mindset as Catholics, the fact that we would overlook that task. Because what this passage is telling us is that the end game of the mission of the church is the making of disciples. That's why we go. That's what we do after. That's why we baptize. We baptize people after we've made disciples, and we teach them ongoing formation, lifelong formation. Now think about it for a second. As Catholics, we're fairly good at going. You go to any country in the world, open the Yellow Pages, we're there. We're fairly good at teaching. We're renowned for our schools, for our curricula, for our pedagogy, at all levels of education, from elementary right through to university education. It's a part of our Catholic tradition to do great teaching. And we're great at baptizing, at least where I come from. We're great at baptizing. We're great at liturgy. We baptize sometimes anything that moves, and even sometimes things that don't move. And we're good at ritual, we're good at liturgy. But arguably, what is our weakness as Catholics? I believe it's making disciples. That is the thing we find hardest to do. And sometimes we put a lot of effort into going and baptizing and teaching, and we get frustrated. Pastoral leaders, priests, lay leaders get frustrated because in spite of our going and our baptizing and our liturgies and our teaching, the frustrating thing is that very few people are becoming disciples. Now, what is a disciple? We'll go to the next slide. The Greek word for disciple is mathetes. So the Greek word for disciple is mathetes. Now, you may recognize an English word in there. The word math comes from the same verb. It means one who learns. It comes from a Greek word manthane, which means to learn. So the primary characteristic of the disciple is a learner, a learner. Now, I want to invite each of you to think back on your own walk with God, your own spiritual journey. And perhaps for some of you, it was a gradual awakening. For others, there was a particular moment, a convergent experience. But for all of us, regardless of our journey, there came a moment where we crossed the line, and that was when we began to hunger for more. We began to have a desire to learn, a desire to know, a desire to grow closer to Jesus, to know about him more and to know him more. We may remember the moment when that happened, we may not, but we know that it's happened. We also know that if you're in pastoral leadership, that this unfortunately does not describe the vast majority of the people who are often in our pews on Sunday mornings. We can preach to people about formation and learning programs and doing it as adults. We can invite people to events. And too often it's the same 10 to 20% of our parishioners who show up for these things, the people who are disciples. Although many of our people are believers, they have faith, Catholics, unfortunately the word disciple does not necessarily define many of the people in our pews. So disciple is one who learns. The English word discipline, of course, gives us the English word. The Latin discipulus gives us the English word discipline, which is related to disciple. And so we also have the sense of a disciple being someone who's engaged in a disciplined process of learning, lifelong, not something that stops at 9th grade or after you're confirmed. The disciple is one who is in a lifelong process of learning and growing, discipleship. This is the end game. This is the ultimate thing that we're looking for in the mission of the church. Lisa, we'll go to the next slide that speaks about the cycle of evangelization. So the goal of the church is to make disciples, and disciples are the ones we know who are the engine of our parishes. We'll go to the next step in the animation, because it's disciples who bring renewal to our church. We know that. They're the key people. They're the people who engage in learning. They're the ones who are involved in ministries, and they're the ones who give. They give significantly more financially than the other members of our parish. And there comes a critical point in our parishes. If we have a critical mass of disciples, our parishes will be renewed. They will become renewed churches. And if they're renewed churches, then the next step is to convert disciples, this is a key part, into apostles. Now, we often use these terms interchangeably, 12 apostles, the disciples. But remember, the original hearers of these words who were familiar with the Greek language knew that there was an essential difference. A disciple is a learner, and an apostle is a missionary, someone who's sent. It comes from apostolane, to be sent. And I sometimes wonder if we would do ourselves a favor in the church and church culture to actually remove these words and instead use the word learner and the word missionary instead. But we'll keep them for now. So apostles then are sent, and that reminds us that the church is inherently missionary, and they go out to evangelize, the next step in the animation. And evangelization is going out and bringing people into the church community so that they can then be discipled. And the cycle continues. The cycle continues. That's a healthy functioning church who makes disciples, disciples renew the church sends out apostles who then evangelize and make more disciples, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, often what happens is the cycle gets clogged up, almost like a photocopier that's not functioning properly. And instead of moving blank pages into the machine to be printed and stapled and send them out, it all gets overheated and clogged up. And sadly, that represents a lot of our churches. Now, let's just go to the next slide for a second. So those are the key moments, and then we'll go to the next one. There we go. So I want to talk about the process of conversion, and this gives us a bit of an insight as to why belonging really is the key. Because a lot has changed in our culture, as I said, in the last 50 years. So traditionally, if you think about it, we lived in societies where people knew how they were to behave. There were strong behavioral norms. Social mores were universally recognized, that people did not go against authority. People knew how to behave. People knew what they believed. They generally had that information. Communities of belief were clearly marked. And some towns you even lived on, what you believed determined what side of the tracks you would live on. And if you behaved and if you believed, then you belonged. But today, we'll go to the next part of the slide, social scientists tell us that it's the opposite. And let's just start with behaving. We know in our postmodern culture that people no longer react to authority, to any authority claim. They will say, I'm not going to behave any particular way just because you tell me I'm supposed to. I'm not going to behave because you say it's in the Bible or even the Pope said it or the church teaches. That doesn't work anymore. People will say, I will behave if I come to believe it for myself. I'm my ultimate authority, and that's the culture in which we live. So people will behave only if they believe it. The question then is, how are people's beliefs changed? And social scientists tell us today that people's belief systems are changed through an experience of belonging. See, belonging becomes the key. Through belonging, people slowly begin to change what they believe, and as people begin to come to believe something different, then they change their behaviors. But typically in our pastoral ministries today, we will often meet people who don't belong and don't believe, and will guilt them and shame them because they don't behave the way we think that they should behave. Another thing for us is, this is challenging for us in our kind of church culture that's still very much impacted by the Enlightenment, by idealism, that we often are interested in the idea of the thing. So we think that we just have to kind of give people the right content, the right theology, the right ideas, and that will convert them. But the vast majority of people in our culture today neither join a church, leave a church, or stay in a church because of doctrine. They join a church, leave a church, or stay in a church because they feel like they belong. It's not to say that doctrine, right doctrine, is not important. It is, but that's just simply the culture in which we live today. So we've got to adjust our pastoral methodologies to reflect that. So it raises a critical question for us, and we'll go to the next slide. If this is so, how do we create meaningful experiences of Christian community in our parishes? How do we create opportunities for people to belong who may not believe what we believe, who may not behave the way we think they should behave. And this is particularly challenging in churches who only have the Eucharist. We'll go to the next slide. Sadly, this does describe many of our churches, that basically we're in maintenance mode. What is the mission of the church? Is to pay the light bills, and keep the Sunday Mass schedule going. That's it. And the only thing we offer, the only experience of the Christian life that the parish offers sometimes is the Eucharist, either daily Eucharist or Sunday Eucharist. Now, the church teaches that the Eucharist is the source and the summit of our Christian lives, and those images themselves tell us that the Eucharist was never intended to be a standalone experience. Because if it's a source, it's the source of something. If it's a summit, it's got to be the summit of something. If there's nothing in between the source and the summit, it cannot be the source and summit of anything. And sadly, in our parishes, the only thing we're offering people is the Eucharist, if there's no experience of community, no experience of the community gathered and caring for one another, of worship and prayer, in formation and making disciples, then the Eucharist is impoverished. The experience of the Eucharist, yes, it's still valid, and yes, we're still uniting ourselves to the one sacrifice of Christ to the Father, etc., etc., but it's not having its proper place in our lives. Let's just go to the next slide. Kinds of sums up what I've just said. Okay, so we'll go to the next one as well. So the question is, are we ready and willing to accept people into community who may not believe and behave the way they should? If we want to be a renewed church, if we want to be an evangelizing church, we have to allow people to belong who may not yet believe and may not yet behave. I'm going to take a little 2-minute break and ask you to watch a little enjoyable video, one of the original Pixar videos called For the Birds. Enjoy. I'll talk to you in a couple of minutes when it's over. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. It makes a very good point, and I think many of us can see the dynamics of those little birds on that wire. Sadly, Sometimes it looks like our parishioners filling up the pews in the morning, the way people hog outside pews and don't like to be moved from their favorite seats and look suspiciously at the outsider, the person who they don't recognize. And it's a big challenge for us, not just in terms of what people experience on Sunday mornings, but how does our whole church culture handle people who obviously don't fit? One of the programs in my search over the years as a pastor to try and address this, a program that I have found that has these values at the heart of it is a program called the Alpha Course. I'll just go to the slide that shows the Alpha Course. Now, I believe that some of you may be familiar with the Alpha Course. I've been involved with this for about 12 years, running it in my parish, and the longer I've been running it, the more convinced I am that it's a very effective tool to reach people on the outside. Its core philosophy is that it is principally for people outside of the church. The core principles are openness, acceptance, being non-judgmental, and it is built on, its core philosophy is belonging, believing, and behaving. That through creating an experience of non-judgmental belonging, where even in the small groups people are encouraged and free to say whatever they want to say, even the most outrageous things, and people are simply accepted. And then there's a process, there's a 10-week process, as the basic message of the gospel is communicated, as people's beliefs begin to slowly change because they've experienced belonging. See, belonging is first. And because they've experienced that these people actually care for me, they actually love me, they actually are interested in what I have to say, very slowly belief begins to change. And then people will have an experience of God. And then towards the end of the course, people are truly beginning to assess the way that they behave. Over the years I've been using this program in my current parish, we have so far in 2 years, 2.5 years, probably had about 1,500, at least 1,500 people have gone through this course. We're running it in different venues, different shapes and sizes, and we usually about 30% of the attendees, 30 to 40% are non-church people. And I haven't found anything like this in a way that is accessible to people outside of the church. Now, as I travel around and speak to church leaders, to Catholic parishes that run the Alpha Course, a common mistake that's often made in running this course is that people view it primarily as a formation program for people already in the pews. And that's our starting point, and we've got it wrong right from the start. It's got to be primarily focused to people outside. It's a tremendous tool for renewal for people in the pews as well, but we've got to remember that it's primarily for those on the outside. And when you form small groups, be very careful not to mix the non-church people with the church people. That's a recipe for disaster. So, but it's a great tool, and I'm currently using it and continue to use it until I find something better. What the Alpha Course taught me through experience and through anecdotes really was solidified for me when I came across a book that I know you're all familiar with, and that is Growing an Engaged Church by Al Winsman. You'll see the next slide there. In a sense, this research from Gallup presented by Al Winsman provided the data, the raw data, the empirical data to support what I only had anecdotal evidence for up until that point. And I remember when I first came across the materials from Gallup, my first reaction was not positive. It was like, oh, this is expensive. And I kind of glanced over it and I thought, well, we're already kind of doing this anyway, and so I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. And it wasn't until about 2-3 years later when someone gave me Al's book, and I read the first line of his book about the church as a heart attack waiting to happen, that he caught my attention. Because in spite of my attempts up until that point to work for renewal, again, there were very limited results. It seemed to be, again, the same minority of parishioners who would come to things and be involved. And in one sense, what I was doing was directly focusing on outcomes. You know, Gallup speaks about the 3 outcomes as increased spiritual commitment, increased service, and increased giving. I mean, those are really the things that we're looking for as pastors, people to grow spiritually, to grow more deeply in their prayer life, to become more loving and serving towards others, and to put more in the collection so that the church can be what it's supposed to be. And you know this story. You know that Gallup took the research they'd done in the business world and asked the question, is this applicable to church life? And by the way, we know that the Gallup family are people of faith, and believe it or not, George Gallup Jr. is a big supporter of Alpha. Again, very in an anecdotal way, these two things this thing that had been very much a part of my ministry and Gallup have come together very, very nicely because they're built on the same principle that belonging comes first. So, you know the story. They did this research and they found in the business world, what is it that sets these companies apart? It's what they called engagement. Engagement. Now, before we continue, just in case there's anyone on this call who's not entirely familiar with the philosophy of this book, just want to stress the importance of defining our words and being on the same page with our words, and sometimes the misunderstandings that can happen if we're not. I'd like to show you a little funny 30-second video that demonstrates this point. Oh, my apologies to anyone of German ancestry. So it's important to be on the same page. And the word engaged is a word that often can be open to misunderstanding. And we'll just go to the next slide. Engaged can make it sound as if we're saying that it's about involvement, people being involved, people being the answer is just to get people busy, get them doing things. And of course, this is not Gallup's sense of engagement. The engagement is a sense of belonging. And this is the key thing that measures the health of a parish. Now, there's a basic principle here that says if we want growth in our parish, if we want our churches to be making disciples, then the goal is not to aim for growth in and of itself. It's to have health. Just the same, if a tree is not bearing fruit, the key is to aim for health, and it will bear fruit all by itself. Those of you who have children, you didn't solemnly sit your children down and tell them, I command you to grow. You fed them, took care of them, made sure they were healthy, and they grew all by themselves. So instead of focusing on outcomes, the point is that we focus on growth. And using the analogy of a tree, the biblical image of the sower who sows, and I think that's the little logo for this community, this engaged community. In one sense, if what we're often doing in pastoral ministry is massaging the leaves or the branches of the tree, saying, please bear fruit, bear fruit. You know, we want increased spirituality, increased spiritual commitment. We want increased giving, increased service. But the problem is not the branches, nor is the problem really the tree. The problem is the soil condition. The soil is toxic. And if we can reduce the toxicity of the soil, then the tree will bear fruit all by itself. So Gallup has a sense of engagement as being the thing that makes the difference. And engagement is a sense of belonging. Imagine that, belonging. Because a sense of belonging opens people up to changing their beliefs, which in turn leads to change of behaviors. Now remember, it's the key. I just got a call. A key opens a door, which then we are to walk through. So there's still this three-stage thing. Now, I'm just going to go to the next slide and show you, it's just a clip of our first ME25 survey that we did in our parish about almost 2 years ago now. This is the survey that is offered from Gallup. And it's called ME25. It stands for Member Engagement 25. And the 25 is for the 25 different questions that are asked. And the questions are broken down in this way. The member engagement items, there are 12 items that contribute towards engagement, the sense of belonging. And then on this survey, there are 9 questions that measure spiritual commitment. And then there are 4 questions that measure outcomes. And then together, that's the 25 questions in the ME25. There's also another 7 questions that provide demographic information, which can be useful as well. But the main thing are these 25 questions, and the most important amongst those 25 are the 12 that deal with member engagement. And of the member engagement questions, the first 6 are actually of much more significance than the second 6. Let's just take a moment to look at each of these 6 questions, and I know for many of you, you are familiar with these. So as a member of my parish, I know what is expected of me. As a member of my parish, I know what is expected of me. Expectation. Number 2, in my parish, my spiritual needs are met. Number 3, in my parish, I regularly have the opportunity to do what I do best. Number 4, in the last month, I have received recognition or praise from someone in my parish. Number 5, the spiritual leaders in my parish seem to care about me as a person. And number 6, there is someone in my parish who encourages my spiritual development. We see that key to these 6 items are that they're all relational. And it reminds us, especially as we're dealing with parishes, typically as Catholic parishes that are big and getting bigger, that if we're not building relational parishes and relational ministry, we're not going to become healthy. And this is certainly a challenge for parishes like ours when we've amalgamated. And sometimes it's a sense, well, if we amalgamate, we can reduce staff and we can save money, but it's not going to lead to healthy parishes. The bigger we are, the smaller we must become. And also, I know that many of you are familiar with the Clifton Strengths Finder. And I'll just say this, that and I hope I don't ruffle any feathers, but I'm a big believer in the Clifton Strengths Finder. We actually have a dedicated staff member who gives probably 30-40% of her time to facilitating Strengths Finder workshops within our parish. We're certainly going down that road. But if you think about it, what this Clifton Strengths Finder does, and in terms of identifying people's themes of talent, is linked to one of these 6 questions. In my parish, I regularly have the opportunity to do what I do best. It is linked to that question. You know, helping people identify what they do best is the basis for then helping them to actually serve out of that particular area of giftedness. But it's only one of 6. In fact, it's one of 12, because if we go to the next slide, we see the other 6 contributors to engagement. As a member of my parish, my opinions seem to count. The mission or purpose of my parish makes me feel my participation is important. The other members of my parish are committed to spiritual growth. And aside from family members, I have a best friend in my parish. In the last 6 months, someone has talked to me about my spiritual life, and in my parish, I have opportunities to learn and grow. So all of these 12 items contribute to engagement. Mostly, though, the first 6 have greater weight. It's my experience that often with parishes who have done Strengths Finder, it's almost as if we want to make Strengths Finder the key or even the door, but even sometimes it does get communicated as almost the goal, that Strengths Finder is the end game itself. Engagement is the key that opens the door that's to be walked through. Strengths Finder, in a sense, is the key to the key, because that item, in my parish, I get to do what I do best, is, Gallup tells us, is the most significant contributor to engagement. These items have greater weight depending on which one we're dealing with. They all contribute in a different way. That's the most significant one, but it's not the only one. And there are others. And I would advocate for a broader approach to engagement, that we shouldn't put all our eggs in the Strengths Finder basket. As key as Strengths Finder is, it's one of 12 items, one of 12. And we have to keep in mind that the goal is not Strengths Finder, the goal is engagement. And engagement is a means to open a door through which we must walk. We have to walk through that door. So let's just look at these 12 items. And I'm going to divide them up into 3 categories. These are not categories provided by Gallup. These are just categories that I looked at and decided to divide them up myself. That there are items that speak about authentic Christian community, items that speak about expectations, and items that speak about strengths-based leadership. let's look quickly, and we're going to go over to the next slide. Authentic Christian community. This is a key thing, because if engagement is essentially belonging, that this raises questions about how we experience ourselves as community. In Matthew chapter 22, we have the parable of the king who sends out his servants to invite people to a wedding banquet. And we hear that the good and the bad were all invited. And the kingdom of God is a banquet, it's a party, it's a joyful thing. So the question is, when we experience community, is it joyful? Is it kind of like a feast? We'll go to the next slide, please. Again, I mentioned at the beginning the words of Tertullian. It's from his Apology, chapter 39, 7. See how they love one another. And I think in one sense, when we use the term Christian community, we have to be honest and say, what does it really mean when we say the Christian community? The Christian community that meets at this particular parish, or the Christian community of this parish. In my own parish, we have 4 different weekend masses, each, 600-700 people at each, and for the most part, the vast majority of the people who go to any mass actually only go to that mass. They rarely venture outside of that particular mass time. And so we really have 4 different worshiping communities, and of the people who go to each mass, most of the time, most of them sit in the exact same pews and only talk to the people around them. So this is a real challenge for us when we're actually defining what community is. Is it a community defined by people who go to a particular mass time and then just simply get lost in the crowd? So I think that we've got to look at a Christian community as being a community in which we are accountable to and accountable for one another. Accountable to and accountable for one another. Now, let's be honest and say, if we were visiting, weren't Catholic, and we dropped into your average Catholic church on a weekend, what would the body language convey? Would the body language of the worshiping community communicate that we were in a group of people who were accountable to and accountable for one another? Well, I think, sadly, we know the answer to that question, because at the end of Mass, even though we may say, go in peace, the Mass is ended, or go and proclaim the gospel of the Lord, too often, if we can have the next slide, we may as well be saying, on your marks, get set, go. Next slide. There we go. There you go. That's often what it's like at my place at the end of Mass. At least it used to be. It's not as bad as it used to be. I remember my first couple of weeks when I was at St. Benedict at the Saturday afternoon Mass, getting overtaken in the closing procession as I left the church, getting overtaken by this little old lady with a walking stick. It was this mad dash. In fact, we had even like 150 people leaving after communion. It was like it was a race to the parking lot. What was communicated is, I don't want to be accountable to you or for you. I don't want to know you. Get out of my way. Get out of my face. In fact, I don't even like being here with you, is what was kind of communicated. So this is a real challenge for us. I remember addressing this in a homily, and if we can have the next slide. I talked about Cheers. Does everyone remember the Cheers theme song? How it speaks to the basic yearnings of the human heart, and I'm just going to play a few seconds of it here for you. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You want to be where I can see someone's all around. You want to be where everybody knows your name. So, there you go. We want to go where people know our name, where our troubles are all the same. It's a basic human yearning, and I think this has got to be a real key to our experience of church. Now, when do we gather at church the most? When do we see 90% of our people 90% of the time? It's at Sunday Mass. It's at Sunday Mass. So the question is, what proportion of our energy that we invest across the board in our parishes is really invested to make the experience of Sunday Mass the best it can be, because that's the biggest bang for our buck. The next slide, please. I've got a quote from my bishop, the Archbishop of Halifax Yarmouth, who in a pastoral letter a year and a half ago said this: the church cannot be a collection of individual believers practicing their faith in private, satisfied with their self-sufficiency. And all too often that's what comes across. It's not that we don't care about each other, it's that deep down our belief is that we're not our brother's keeper. You know, it's none of our business. We're there as private individuals. And let's remember the words of Pope Francis just a couple of days ago, just exhorting us to really care for each other and to take care of each other and to look out for each other and to be tender with each other. That's going to open the door for people to experience a deep sense of belonging. So how have we tried to do this? Go to the next slide. How have we tried to do this at St. Benedict? Well, we've tried a number of things, and I'm going to offer these to you as suggestions. I know I've only got about 15 minutes left, but I just want you to know that before I tell you this, that we did have the follow-up meeting after we did the ME25 survey the first time, and we had meetings with Al Winsman, and we had a facilitated session, and we chose some strategies. We were also implementing different pastoral approaches that we knew would impact engagement, and we did our second ME25 last May, and it was a bit nerve-wracking as I waited for the results, because I was all in with this and kind of proposing to the community that we could measure health, the health of our community. To let you know that when we first did the ME25, our results were pretty typical of the average Catholic parish. Our results in February 2011 were that we were 24% engaged, 47% unengaged, and 29% actively disengaged. Now, just to review these categories that the survey breaks your parishioners down into, engaged are people who are wildly enthusiastic about your church. They love it. They're bought in. They love the vision. They feel inspired by it. They're all in. These are people who are much more spiritually committed. They tend to be much more likely to invite others to your church, and they typically give about 7 to 8 times more financially than the other members. They're the great members. Unengaged are people who are generally happy with the parish, but they're not really involved. It doesn't really make much of a difference in their life. But if you say, are you happy with the parish? They will say, yes, we are. The actively disengaged are the people who feel not bought in. They don't feel like they're questioning whether they really belong. They don't like the vision. Let's be careful here. Actively disengaged parishioners are the ones who are coming behind you as you're building things up, tearing it down. And they may, in fact, be people who are involved. They may, in fact, be people who are leading ministries. They're the opposition party. So we were 24% engaged, 47% unengaged, and 29% actively disengaged. Now, just to give you a sense of what Gallup defines as health, Gallup says that to get rid of the toxicity in the soil, you need to have a proportion of 2 engaged members to neutralize the toxicity of 1 actively disengaged parishioner. It needs to be 2 to 1. So in February 2011, we were 24% engaged, 29% actively disengaged, which is hugely unhealthy. Now remember, we were actually slightly better than the average Catholic parish who does this. And we were the first Catholic parish in Canada to do this. So most of these are US-based parishes. So over the year that followed, we had put a number of things into practice to try to change this. And in waiting for the results, I was really nervous, because if the results came back without an improvement, I'd almost, I thought I'll probably have to resign or something. But to our great relief, we saw the following change. We had moved from 24% engaged to 33% engaged. Our unengaged was 48% as opposed to 47%, pretty much the same. But our actively disengaged had gone down to 19%. Very, very interesting. So what happens is that people move from the central category over to engaged, and the actively disengaged become unengaged. And these changes, it happens through addition and attrition. I have to say that. We've got a lot of new people who have joined our church, who have been evangelized. And then quite honestly, there have been members who have simply left, who have said, we don't feel that we belong here, and they've gone somewhere else. We don't buy the vision. What's interesting is the net results of this is that the first survey, we were 0.83 to 1 proportion of engaged to actively disengaged, and that change in 1 year moved us to a 1.73 to 1. So it was almost, the proportion was doubled. So you were twice as likely to walk through the door the following year and meet engaged members than you were the year before, and that's a tremendous change. So just to give you a sense that what I'm about to talk about, the things we did, actually did make a difference, and we've got the numbers to show it. And we're going to do another ME25 survey probably in about another 6 months or so. So I hope you're still with me. Again, Sunday Eucharist, I said, is the biggest bang for a buck. It's where we get most of our people. If we can go to the next slide, Lisa. Again, we've heard that the kingdom of God is a party. We'll go to the next slide. We saw that in the parable of Jesus. And I just believe that if we really invest a lot of our energy and resources into making Sunday morning the best it can be, that people, I think our goal should be that when people leave church, they're saying, wow, that was amazing. It's not that we're there to entertain people or anything like that, but I think too often we've just become mundane. People should leave with a deep sense of wow, of being wowed. It's a pretty easy thing. The old traditional 3 H's, hymns, homilies, and hospitality. Preaching, music, and hospitality. It's not that complicated. Let's look at hospitality first. We'll go to the next slide. I think what's important is creating a culture of hospitality in our parishes, and that means that it's not just the priest or the parish staff or even the committee members who are in charge of hospitality, but that it is every single parishioner to continue to speak about that, to speak about the power of a smile and how we're all on the hospitality team to be welcoming. But we also have to be intentional and focused as well. We'll go to the next slide. One of the things we did in the first year was I realized that at the end of Mass, when people left church, people would always say, Father, how do I find out about this? Or how do I do this? Or how do I sign up for the parish? And I realized there was nothing visible. We had no visible welcome area. So we created this mobile welcome booth, which is, it folds out. It's got an iMac in it. It's got all of our brochures and pamphlets and our hearing aid devices, and we hook it up to a big screen television that runs slides for upcoming events. And it's a contact point for visitors and new people. It's a place that we can send people to. There's teams of people who are there every single Mass. And as good as this is, and as well as it works, I'm realizing as well that it's still not enough. That I'd like to eventually build a whole permanent desk that creates an atmosphere of welcoming and hospitality for people who are visiting. Because on any given Sunday, we've simply got a huge amount of people who are checking us out. And sadly, even still, most of them fall through our fingers. So hospitality is key. Secondly, we'll go to the next slide. Something we introduced was Name Tag Sunday. We actually have one Sunday a month where everyone gets a name tag, all 2,000 people. We encourage people to bring to their own name tags, and then we have markers and the little paper name tags. And I love Name Tag Sunday. The first time we did this, we thought, well, are we going to have a pushback on this? And we only received 3 complaints, and the complaints were all, why don't we do this more often? We need to do this more often. So it was very, very exciting. And people are getting used to it, and it's become a symbol of what we aspire to. We aspire, just like the Cheers song says, to be a place where everyone knows your name. And simply because most people go to the same Mass and sit in the same pew, it's actually a possibility. It's a wonderful experience. And of course, there is the loyal opposition, those who simply refuse to wear a name tag, those who, as a matter of principle, want to hold on to Catholicism Anonymous. But they've got to get through about 7 lines of defense. I mean, they've got to say no to about 7 people before they get into church, and then they've got to deal with me going up to them and saying, "Oh, what's your name?" So it's starting to catch on. Another thing we do, we'll go to the next slide, prayer partners at Mass. This is very, very interesting because over the years as a parish priest, at the beginning of Mass, after the greeting, before we go into the penitential rite, there is a place where we can welcome people, say good morning, welcome visitors and such. And in the past, I've perhaps asked people to turn around and introduce themselves and say good morning. But over this last 2 years, we've changed what we do. What we in fact do is this. We say, good morning, everyone. As we gather for the Eucharist this morning, let's take a moment to turn to someone around us, someone we don't know, and you're going to find that person's name, and you're going to pray for them during this Mass, and they're going to pray for you. You don't need to know what you're praying for. And we invite people to turn and do that. And it's very interesting what happens because people are getting the person's name, and then later at the prayers of the faithful, we actually pause and say, and for the person we met at the beginning of Mass. Sometimes we even invite the person to turn around and look at the person to be reminded of who they are and to lift that person up in silent prayer. And what it does is it creates spiritual bonds, and it helps to move people out of this sense that when I come to Mass, I'm just there to pray for my own needs and my own family. And we've heard stories of people who were in tears at the end of Mass saying, I came here very burdened, I came here wondering if anyone actually cared, if it made any difference, and I'm leaving here feeling supported and prayed for and cared for. A very small thing that takes a very little amount of energy that makes a huge difference. Go to the next slide. One of the things we do once a month at the end of Mass is prayer ministry. We have teams of lay people that we've trained in the Alpha model of praying with others. And at the very end of Mass, they come up to the front. We have teams of men and teams of women. We ask the men to go to the men, the women to go to the women. And as I process out and I'm standing at the entrance to the church shaking hands, people are coming forward to receive silent prayer, or people are praying out loud. They're putting a hand on their shoulder, very respectful, not anything wacky or strange, but people are being ministered to. People are receiving prayer in a way that I couldn't provide as a single priest in this big parish. And I find it very, very exciting because ministry like that is happening, lives are being touched, and I'm at the front shaking hands. And every weekend when we do this once a month, there are usually about 70 to 80 people who receive prayer ministry. And all of these things are little contributors to help people have a sense that they actually belong. Let's go to the next slide. A formation of small communities. Again, this is in the whole area of meaningful community. As I said, the bigger we are, the smaller we have to become. We have to be intentional. If you survey parishes that are actually making disciples and are healthy and growing, all of them have at their foundation a system of small group communities. Now, what we have done through the philosophy of the Alpha Course, if you go to the next slide, is the Alpha Course provides people, either from outside the church or from within the church, an essential experience of Christian community that they've never had before. Through the experience of small groups, going on retreat together, being prayed with by people in the small group, they begin to experience community as a place where you're accountable to and accountable for one another. Even lifelong churchgoers have said, I didn't know this kind of community experience was possible. But what we try to do when people finish Alpha, we try to get the guests to come back onto another course as team members, but we also feed people into a system of what we call pastorates. We'll go to the next slide. Pastorates are groups of 25 to 30 people. They're not small groups, so small groups are generally 8 to 12. 25 to 30 people. They're lay-led. They meet twice a month for a meal for prayer, teaching, and fellowship, and they're open-ended. People can move from one group to another. And we started last year with 4 pastorates meeting in homes, and now we have 6 groups as they've begun to grow. And wonderful things are happening in these groups. I have a staff member who oversees the leadership of these groups, so there is an accountability system, but community is being formed, people are being loved and cared for and discipled, and for the most part, I'm oblivious to most of what happens there, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful because all this ministry is happening. And that is key, because here is an experience of belonging that people can have who may not be ready or prepared to go to the Eucharist. They have an experience of belonging where they can begin to change their belief system and begin to change the way they behave. Go to the next slide. It's the next category of engagement items. Comes under the title of expectations. Now, there is an explicit question about in the ME25 about, as a member of my parish, I know what is expected of me. And but there are other items that speak more to engagement than just that one. I just want to speak briefly about the concept of engagement. We'll go to the next slide, please. If you look at this table, you see that we have 2 values, acceptance or welcoming, and expectation. And there's 4 possibilities in terms of how we relate these values to one another. First of all, if you look at the bottom left quadrant, that represents church, where the culture of the church has low acceptance. That means it's not a very welcoming parish, and sadly some of our parishes are like that. And also there is low expectation. So it's a parish in which nothing really is expected of the members, or at least expectations are not communicated. If we move over to the right, you'll see that that's an option where there is low welcoming, low acceptance, and high expectation, which basically says, we don't really like you or want you, but we'll use you. We want to use you. And hopefully that kind of culture does not exist anywhere. If we go up to the top left, this actually describes my parish of St. Benedict when I first arrived. There was a very high value placed on accepting and welcoming people, but nothing was expected. Expectations were not communicated whatsoever. And when I came and suggested that we start speaking the language of expectation, our hospitality team were actually quite horrified, and it took quite a lot of coaching and working with them over a year to get them to get on board with us. Because really what we want is found in the top right-hand quadrant. We want to create churches where there is high welcoming and low expectation. Now, for the sake of time, I realize I'm almost out of time. Lisa, should I keep on going? We'll skip over the video of the little cruise ship video thingy. So we'll go to the next slide that speaks about the 5 expectations.
And yeah, let's do this as Father James continues to talk with us. If questions have occurred to you, if you would please type those in our chat box. I'll be monitoring those questions so that if we have things that you would like to discuss more directly with him, I can share your questions with him. So I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to be watching those comments in the chat box, and Father James is going to continue. How's that?
Great, and I'll try to finish in another 5 minutes.
Okay, and so are we ready then for this next little video?
No, we're going to skip the video.
Okay, we're going to skip it. Gotcha. Okay, we're moving on.
Yeah.
Super.
Okay, so the little video basically was, it asked the question, what's your image of church? Is it a cruise ship or a battleship? In the sense that we often think of churches as a place that serves our needs and nothing is expected of us, whereas we need to see that the church is on mission and that there is actually expectations. What are the 5 expectations that we've been speaking about at St. Benedict Parish? They are as follows. You can see on the screen: to worship, to connect, to grow, to serve, to give. You can go on our parish website and you'll see that we've structured the main headings and content of our website around these 5 expectations. We put them on the front of our weekly newsletter. We've just published a brochure that you can get on our website, saintbenedict.ca, S-A-I-N-T, benedict.ca. The expectations brochure we haven't yet distributed to our parishioners. It's brand new. It's on our website. And it kind of unpacks some of these expectations. First of all, it communicates what parishioners can expect from the parish and then what is expected of parishioners by the parish. So the expectation to worship is that we worship every Sunday, unless we're sick or out of town. To connect is that we expect parishioners to make a conscious effort to build community, to connect with each other. To grow is about discipleship. To grow is discipleship. It's about learning and growth, and we expect every parishioner from the ages of 5 to 105 to commit to 1 program of spiritual growth per year. To serve is another expectation. We expect of all of our parishioners to serve out of their giftedness, their area of giftedness, and for every parishioner to commit to doing 1 thing. And then to give, that every parishioner gives proportionally, and it gives in proportion to what they have received financially. Again, I remind you of that quote from Michelangelo. If we can go to the next slide. That the greater danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss, but that it's too low and we reach. So I don't make any apologies for expectations, even if it makes a few people uncomfortable. Let's go to the next slide. Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. It's the parable of the talents. And if you've ever imagined what that parable looks like in your imagination, you may think of the master handing a few coins to his servants. Remember that the master gave one servant 3 talents, one 2 talents, and the other 1 talent. What's very interesting is that a talent was a unit of weight. Actually, it was 130 pounds of weight. And remember, the master gave a talent of gold. So he actually gave the guy that got the 1 talent, the one who buried it in the ground, he received 130 pounds of gold, which in today's market value would have been $3,299,186. It wasn't a little coin he received. It was a thing of tremendous value. The guy that had the 3 talents was like worth $16 million. And the point is that the Lord expects us to do something with this. He said to the man who buried it in the ground, at the very least you could have put it in the bank. You see, he wasn't even expecting him to do that. What he wanted from him was venture capitalism. He wanted to take risks. And we need to do this as a church. Someone once said, if you're a church leader, you're either going to be a risk taker a caretaker or an undertaker. And we need to be risk takers because the Lord expects growth. He expects a return on his investment. We go to the next slide. This is expected of believers individually and corporately. Next slide. We expect a return on our investments, or at least we used to. And next slide, we expect growth from a healthy tree. We have a parable about that, about the fig tree and the man who wanted to cut it down because he expected fruit and growth and he didn't get it. And so, the next slide, if the church is not growing, if it's not bearing fruit, we have to simply recognize that it's not healthy. And of course, Gallup is telling us that the key to health is engagement, which is belonging. This brings me to just quickly the spirituality of stewardship and how we have leveraged the traditional concepts of stewardship to fit into this framework and try to move the engagement ball forward. We have, over the last 2 years, introduced 3 distinct initiatives, stewardship initiatives. Now, I know that many of you come from parishes, I'm sure, that actually have an annual stewardship appeal. If we can go to the next slide. I'll just very quickly, let me just go back one, thank you. So stewardship of time, talent, and treasure. So this is what we do. We have defined stewardship of time as the investment parishioners make in their own spiritual lives. So it's about their own faith formation. It's about discipleship. This is discipleship. And we do this in September. We do the 5-week initiative, the letter going home to parishioners, the homily, the lay witnesses, the booklet, and the stewardship fair, and the commitment Sunday. We do that in September. That sets people up for the year. We publish a book that has all of our faith formation programs. This year we were offering 63 different faith formation opportunities over 90 times, and we ask everyone to commit to something. That's in September. And then if we can move 2 slides forwards to stewardship of talents, we do stewardship of talent in January, starting on the Feast of the Epiphany, the wise men who laid down their gifts to the Lord, and we do the same thing, the 5-week process. Talent is about serving others. So we make the distinction. Time is receiving, it's your own spiritual formation, your commitment to your prayer life, and faith formation. Talent is service to others, and we have over 80 service ministries in our parish to choose from. And then after Easter, we do stewardship of treasure. And if we could advance 2 slides again, where we invite people to actually make a commitment to the different ways in which you can give Sunday collection, second collections, to our debt reduction and such. So these, by creating this practice, we're now in our 2nd year of doing this, by sticking with this, what we're actually doing is reshaping expectations. What seem to be outrageous impositions on people, people begin to just accept it. Oh, that's what we do here. That's normal. And we know that this is going to continue to take time, and we've got the statistics of how the proportions of people who have responded to this, but we know that it's going to be a 5 to 6 year effort to really move to the point that the vast majority of our parishioners see this as normal and expect it to be coming around. And 2 more slides, please, Lisa, and I'm almost finished. I do apologize for going over time here. But the 3rd category of the engaged items is strength-based leadership. And if you're familiar with StrengthsFinder, you know the basic principle about this is that you begin with people's strength. People are released into life-giving ministry when they're working out of their strengths. If their starting point in ministry is the need that needs to be filled, the person who's serving, if it's not matching their gifts, become miserable, and they make everyone else miserable. And so that's good to be a clear commitment to strengths-based leadership, that our starting point is not the need or the roles that need to be filled, the holes that need to be filled, but rather starting with people and their particular gifts and then fitting them into ministry. The second thing in strengths-based leadership is constantly training not just our parish staff, but our ministry leaders to be on the lookout for other leaders, because the measure of a leader is not how many followers you have, it's how many leaders that you can call forth. So constantly looking out to see who can lead, because the job is not to do the job, it's to call forth other people to do the job, which means as leaders, whether it's pastoral leaders, whether it's the priest or lay staff or ministry leaders, constantly we speak about the push-away principle, that calling forth leaders and pushing away, empowering people to take on tasks. And we'll just go to the next slide. So all of these kinds of changes, these cultural changes, of course, require courage from pastoral leaders. Change is difficult. It's never going to be easy. And if we go to the next slide, heard someone say that if the church is actually going to start moving in this direction, then it's very important as leaders that we put the sign on the bus. If you remember taking a bus waiting on a busy street, the first thing you look for is the sign on the bus to see, where is this bus going? Do I actually want to get on this bus, or do I actually want to get off this bus? And to be honest, when we do work for this kind of change in the culture of our parishes, there will be people who will want to get off. The people say, look, I was happy with the bus sitting in the parking lot for the last 20 years. I didn't expect this thing to be going anywhere. So we've got to constantly communicate the direction. And that means as parish leaders, as pastoral leaders, that we're always communicating the vision, the direction to our teams. As a parish priest, I believe that we've got to preach about it not just once a year or once every 6 months, but every 3 weeks I preach at all the masses in my parish, and I preach a kind of visioning homily. Where are we going? Why are we going there? Why are we doing what we're doing? And what was it about the things we used to do that are not, that making them not effective anymore? Because we've got to be careful that we avoid creating a sense that we're somehow blaming people who worked so hard in the past. And just in conclusion, the next slide. A number of years ago, I found myself waiting at a traffic light. There was 2 lanes of traffic, and the light changed from red to green, and the inside lane did not move. The outside lane moved. And this happened 2 or 3 times as the lights changed, and I found myself becoming increasingly impatient with this line of traffic that didn't move. And finally, I pulled out to pass into the second lane, only to realize that the entire time I had been sitting behind a row of parked cars, because there had been a heavy snowstorm, and the cars were further out. And I just want to say that sometimes what prevents us from going forward in the church are not real obstacles, but rather perceived obstacles. I want to finish with a quote from Martin Luther King. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it policy? And vanity comes along and asks, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? The ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in moments of convenience, but where they stand in moments of challenge, moments of great crisis and controversy. Thank you so much for your time, and I do apologize for going over time. God bless you.
Oh, Father James, please do not apologize. This has been wonderful. We do have a few questions, but I think I could summarize a number of them just by asking, just briefly, Father James, could you sort of share with us, how have you and all of the folks at St. Benedict communicated to others? How did you get participation in the ME25? How do you get participation in Alpha? How do you get these people to sign up for pastorates? A lot of the questions are of that nature. How do you encourage people to come on board in the midst of something that may seem very different from what they've known in the past?
Yeah, it basically means doing 2 things. Hitting the big red stop button and sounding and pulling the fire alarm. Mm. And that's what's going to happen. We have process in our parishes. We have pastoral methodologies. And so much of what we're doing is not working. It's based on the pastoral presumptions, the cultural presumptions of 50 years ago, where we seem to be locked into them, trapped. We can't get out of them. We're on this treadmill. We're wasting resources and time and bearing very little fruit in the way of making disciples. So someone's got to have the courage to hit the big red stop button. And that's risky, because it means that we've got to step out of our comfort zone. So that's the first thing. And obviously only the pastor has to do this. And so I realize I may not have a lot of pastors on the call here, but that's what it takes, hitting the big red stop button and then pulling the fire alarm. Obviously, I mean that metaphorically. Because what our church is saying, and all of this talk of the new evangelization, all of the documents in it is, it cannot be business as usual. It cannot mean when there's a fire in the building, it's not business as usual. You've got to get up off your butts and do something different. And so from the leadership, there's got to be a pulling of the fire alarm. Attention, the end is imminent unless we change what we're doing. The big ship is heading for the rocks. We've got to turn the ship around. We've got to start doing something different. So it begins with a projection of vision, not just about, what are the dangers or the challenges of continuing to do business as usual. The fact that 10, 20 years from now, we're going to be on the rocks because of the changing culture. But we've got to have a vision for what it can be. It can be different. And that means we've got to have, as the leaders of the parish, have to have a vision for how it can be different. See, it's not just enough to think outside the box, but get outside the box. And I'm going to say that again. It's not enough to think outside of the box. We've got to get outside of the box and go somewhere and see a parish or a church, whether it's Catholic or non-Catholic, and see a church that's doing it differently, and realize it's possible to do it differently. And then it's the hard work, because once you do that, then you've got to create invitations, and you've got to come at it again and again and again and again and again. So the first thing I did, my first months in the parish, is we got there in August. So it was too late to really start anything new pastorally for the coming ministry semester, from September to Christmas. So we put a focus on Alpha. The Alpha is, I consider, not just one program among many. Now, we have 63 different programs of faith formation. Alpha is one of them, but Alpha is foundational, because Alpha is mission-oriented. It's oriented outside of the church for people coming in, and it also contains within itself all of these values that I talked about, because in the end, values are shown not by what we say we believe, but by what we do. And so if the values of Alpha can permeate the entire life of the church, we're going to move much further towards being healthy. So the first thing we did is we created a vision of what this could be, and we put a call out for people to be trained as leaders. We had 160 people step forward to be trained as Alpha leaders, and that gave us the ability to go forward and to launch 3 or 4 different Alphas in different times. We had morning Alpha for young mothers, we had lunchtime Alpha, we had evening Alpha, Alpha in a pub. We've just got a group starting next week going into one of the local prisons, and from there, once people had experienced Alpha and had a taste of what Christian community can be like, we started to form pastorates. And of course, once people are evangelized, come alive in their faith and become disciples, they hunger for more. And very readily, people were signing up for other programs. Then comes the stewardship initiative, because when you actually lay out, okay, we're actually expecting people to do this. The first year, we got about a 30% response. This year, for stewardship of time, we had a 40% response. Now, I was aiming for 100%, but as Michelangelo says, if you aim too low, you got to aim high. So that means that 30% of our adults committed to doing a faith formation program in the coming year. Now, that's fantastic, 40%. We've got to keep on doing this. There's no way around this. You've just got to keep doing it so that we begin to change the sense of expectation and the perception of what's normative. And then you begin to communicate stories of changed lives. So we want to create a culture of testimony, so that it begins to be seen that church is a place where you don't want to go if you don't want your life to be changed. Like, this is a place where people have their lives transformed. So we have we'll have often lay witnesses. Sometimes instead of a homily, I'll do an interview. Sometimes in our newsletter we will put in testimonies. All of our ministry leaders, if someone says, my life was impacted by taking this program or this ministry, we ask them to put it in writing. And we have my director of evangelization sends me 2 or 3 times a week written testimonies of people saying my life has been changed. It's amazing. It's amazing. And when we communicate these things, it just changes the culture. It changes the whole feel of the place, that we're beginning to expect this. So that was a long answer. I hope that's helpful.
But it was a wonderful answer, and I do want to thank you, Father James, and I want to thank everyone for being with us today. As I mentioned earlier, the recording for this session will be placed as a link on the CSEC Connected community either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So you'll be able to go back to that. And I also know Father James and some of the others from St. Benedict are members of the CSEC site, so they're on. You can contact them directly if you've got additional questions or thoughts, as well as me, Lisa Anslinger, if you would like to chat about any of this. I know a few of us have been sort of having sideline chats, and we can continue those or maybe talk on the phone in the coming days to continue this wonderful conversation. But thank you all so much, and thank you, Father James, just for a wonderful session and very inspiring. I think you've got us all fired up, and now we're all ready to go out and hit that fire alarm. So thanks so much, and have a blessed day, all of you. Thanks much. Take care, and God bless.